If someone told you that 9% of Americans are millionaires, would you believe them? It sounds impressive until you learn that only about 2% actually have $1 million that they can access and invest. That means 98% of so-called millionaires can't use most of their wealth when it matters most. Today, we're diving into why a seven-figure net worth doesn't always equal financial freedom, and what separates the perception of wealth from the reality. Because before you can reach $1 million that truly works for you, it's worth asking, how much of that money is actually yours to use? That brings us to what many call the millionaire illusion, the belief that hitting a seven-figure net worth automatically means financial independence. On the surface, it sounds like success. But in reality, most people who technically qualify as millionaires aren't nearly as financially free as they seem. Here's why. Net worth is simply the value of everything you own minus everything you owe. That includes your home, your car, maybe a small business, or some retirement accounts. It paints a broad picture, but it doesn't distinguish between money you can actually use and money locked inside illiquid assets. Your house might make you feel wealthy, but it won't help much if you need quick cash for an emergency or want to invest in an opportunity that can grow your income. This is where investable assets comes into play. These are the resources you can easily convert to cash. Money sitting in a checking or savings accounts, funds in brokerage or retirement accounts, stocks, bonds, or mutual funds. They're liquid, meaning they can move or grow without you selling your home or business. What they don't include are assets like real estate, other than real estate investment trusts, vehicles, collectibles, or privately owned businesses. Anything that's difficult or slow to turn into spendable money. When you look at the data through that lens, the idea of being a millionaire looks very different. Roughly 9% of American adults have a net worth above $1 million, yet only around 2%, about 1 in 50 people, actually hold $1 million or more in investable assets. That small fraction represents the truly financially flexible, those whose money can work for them rather than being tied up in walls or equipment. Consider this example. Someone owns a home worth $900,000 and has $150,000 in savings and retirement funds. On paper, their net worth clears the $1 million mark. But in daily life, their situation can still feel tight. Property taxes climb, maintenance costs add up, and a sudden job loss could drain what little liquidity they have. Selling their house might unlock more money, but it would also mean giving up the very asset that defined their millionaire status. They're wealthy on paper, but not when it comes to choices or flexibility. This asset-rich but cash-poor pattern is surprisingly common. People see their net worth grow through rising home values or business equity, but those assets don't pay the bills or generate income unless sold. Liquid wealth, by contrast, functions like oxygen. You notice its importance only when it's missing. Without it, people can feel financially suffocated despite having substantial total wealth. That lack of accessible cash becomes a hidden form of financial stress, even for people with impressive net worths. Once you understand that distinction, financial freedom takes on a new shape. True wealth isn't the number you see on a balance sheet. It's about control. Real millionaires have wealth that moves and generates income without disrupting their lifestyle. Their wealth gives them options, not obligations. It's what allows them to make decisions from a place of strength rather than necessity. Seeing progress through this lens also changes how people measure success. A rising home value might inflate your net worth, but it doesn't bring immediate flexibility. Meanwhile, a smaller but growing pool of investments quietly builds independence. That steady accumulation creates the kind of wealth that compounds over time, wealth that supports rather than restricts your life. And that's where most people misunderstand the journey. The illusion of millionaire status comes early, but genuine liquidity usually takes decades to build. For many, that turning point doesn't appear until far later in life, when debts shrink and investments finally outpace expenses. Understanding when and how that shift happens reveals the real shape of wealth, and it looks very different from how most imagine it. That timing isn't random. It follows a predictable pattern economists call the wealth curve, showing when net worth actually peaks across a lifetime. Wealth doesn't rise in a steady line. It starts off slowly, flattens through much of adulthood, and then surges near the end. For most people, significant gains don't appear until their 50s or later, long after the early years of paying off loans and managing day-to-day expenses. Household data makes the curve easy to see. The median net worth for Americans under 35 sits around $39,000. It climbs to about $135,000 between ages 35 and 44, and roughly $247,000 by the mid-50s. The real jump happens later, between ages 65 and 74, when the average household reaches about $410,000. Yet even at this financial high point, that figure still represents less than half of the $1 million benchmark. The reality is that the typical American never even comes close to $1 million in total net worth, and much of what they do accumulate remains locked away in a home that can't easily be turned into spendable cash. The slow climb explains why many younger households feel behind despite earning reasonable incomes. Their paychecks are stretched across expenses that have ballooned in recent decades, everything from college debt to childcare and housing. The national savings rate now hovers closer to 5%, about half of what it was in the 1980s. For someone earning $100,000 a year, that's just $5,000 in annual savings, a figure that barely covers emergency reserves, let alone long-term goals like retirement or investing for growth. Against those numbers, early wealth accumulation feels frustratingly out of reach. When asked when they expect to become millionaires, people often answer confidently, their 30s or 40s. But reality tells another story. The average age of a US millionaire today is about 61, several years older than in the 1980s. Even when you adjust for inflation and recognize that $1 million today buys far less than it did then, it still takes longer to reach that number. In other words, becoming a millionaire has shifted from a mid-career milestone to something achieved near the end of the working years, if it's achieved at all. So what changes in those later decades to finally push wealth upwards? The major turning point comes when debt disappears. Mortgage payments shrink or vanish entirely, student loans are gone, and children have grown financially independent. With fewer obligations eating into monthly income, more money stays in the household, and salaries often peak around that same time. Those freed up dollars finally flow into investments with the power to compound, retirement accounts, brokerage portfolios, and other assets that grow quietly year after year. The composition of wealth also evolves in a way that steepens the curve. In the early years, much of the household's worth resides in depreciating items, cars, furniture, or a first home that requires constant upkeep. Later on, the balance shifts towards appreciating assets, stocks, bonds, and funds that generate dividends or capital gains. That shift transforms the pace of growth. Suddenly, smaller contributions create larger jumps because each dollar invested is now working alongside decades of accumulated compounding returns. By the time a household reaches its 60s, the combination of reduced debt, higher income, and maturing investments finally accelerates net worth. Yet even with those advantages, liquidity remains limited. Most of that wealth is still locked inside real estate or retirement accounts, not easily accessed without taxes or penalties. So while the average person may appear more secure on paper, day-to-day flexibility often arrives much later than expected, or never fully does. Understanding this age curve reveals that wealth peaks when time and compounding finally converge, not when effort alone increases. For many, the challenge isn't earning more, it's staying consistent long enough for progress to become visible. And that patience, tested hardest in the years when growth feels invisible, ends up being the single most powerful force in building real wealth. While time shapes the overall curve of wealth, it's compounding that gives the curve its force, and it rewards patience far more than speed. In the beginning, the progress feels almost invisible. You contribute regularly, yet the balance barely moves. But what's happening underneath is exponential growth still in its infancy. Each early deposit is quietly laying the groundwork for future returns that will one day build on themselves. That early stretch can test even the most disciplined saver. It's common to feel like you're pushing a boulder uphill, adding money month after month with little visible change. The psychological trap is assuming the effort isn't paying off, when in fact those years are the engine room of financial growth. Many people stop here, cashing out or pausing contributions right when compounding is about to tip in their favor. It's one of the most expensive mistakes investors make, because once momentum breaks, time, your greatest ally, starts working against you. In the early years of investing, almost all growth comes from what you personally contribute. The returns earned on those contributions might look small, but they're quietly stacking the conditions for future acceleration. As more principal builds up, the returns compound on top of earlier gains rather than just your deposits. That's why the early years feel slow yet matter most. Pulling back too soon is like leaving a marathon before the downhill stretch begins. You miss the moment when compounding finally starts to work harder than you do. The real turning point comes decades later, often after age 50. That's when compounding begins to show visible strength. Years of steady contributions, reinvested earnings, and consistent returns finally gather critical mass. At this stage, most debts are shrinking or gone. Incomes have peaked, and a large portion of net worth exists in appreciating assets rather than expenses or loans. The same monthly contribution that once seemed to barely matter can now add tens of thousands in growth thanks to the snowball effect. The balance starts feeding on itself, and that's when financial independence starts to feel genuine. Compounding is mathematical, but staying invested long enough to feel its effect is psychological. In a culture wired for quick outcomes, waiting decades for meaningful results feels unnatural. We track progress daily, expect instant feedback, and get restless when growth takes time. But compounding punishes impatience. Every interruption, skipped contributions, early withdrawals, emotional reactions to market dips breaks the chain of growth. The investors who endure those quiet years, staying consistent throughout boredom and doubt, are the ones who end up far ahead. This process mirrors how wealth naturally evolves through life stages. In your early career, most savings flow towards essentials, repaying loans, covering childcare, or managing household expenses. As those burdens lift, available income expands. Redirecting even a portion of that new cash into investments creates a multiplier effect. The money added now compounds on an already mature base, triggering that acceleration zone where balances begin climbing faster each year without any increase in effort. It may seem sudden from the outside, but it's really decades of discipline converging all at once. The irony is that the toughest phase of compounding, the early invisible years, is exactly when it's easiest to give up. The later acceleration only exists because of those frustrating beginnings. That quiet consistency turns into visible freedom over time. The investor who remains steady long enough for the math to take over discovers that patience doesn't just pay, it multiplies. Still, most people never reach the point where compounding can truly work for them. If only 2% ever achieve $1 million in investable assets, that raises an important question. What separates that small group from everyone else who tries? Reaching that level of true liquidity isn't about luck or timing. It's about turning the odds in your favor through habits that last. The people who reach the real 2% share a surprisingly consistent playbook. They don't chase flashy returns or gamble on the next big trend. Instead, they focus on reliability, structure, and discipline, habits that might look ordinary from the outside, but quietly accumulate extraordinary results over time. And here's something most people don't expect. The professions most likely to produce millionaires aren't always tech founders or Wall Street traders. Research shows many are teachers, engineers, and accountants, roles built on patience, attention to detail, and rational decision-making rather than exceptionally high salaries. The advantage they have isn't in income, it's in behavior. They earn steadily, spend carefully, and invest regularly. That consistency, rather than one big break, is what compounds into financial independence decades later. But math still matters, and it's not on the average saver's side. In the 1980s, households typically saved around 10% of their income. Now that rate has dropped to about 5%. For someone earning $100,000 a year, that's a slide from saving $10,000 annually to just $5,000. On paper, it doesn't look fatal, but over 20 years, with compounding, it's the difference between financial stability and falling behind. When expenses rise faster than wages, the gap can only be closed through intentional control of spending and a steady habit of saving before those dollars disappear into lifestyle upgrades. That last point, controlling lifestyle creep, is where most people lose ground. As incomes rise, spending almost always follows. It feels harmless at first, a nicer car payment, a move to a bigger house, an extra vacation. But every one of those upgrades locks in higher monthly costs and eats up the very money that could become tomorrow's investable wealth. And it's not just affecting those barely scraping by. Roughly 1/3 of households earning $200,000 a year or more still live paycheck to paycheck. That statistic alone shows how even top earners can end up without real liquidity if lifestyle keeps outpacing savings. Those who successfully join the 2% flip that script. They build systems that protect their progress by removing choice from the equation. Saving happens automatically. The moment income arrives, a preset transfer sends it to investment accounts before it ever reaches a spending balance. That approach replaces daily discipline with structure. Over time, these automated behaviors turn savings into the default rather than the exception, allowing progress to unfold almost invisibly in the background. Debt management plays a similar role. Each dollar not owed becomes an extra dollar available to invest. Self-made millionaires tend to maintain low personal debt, not because they avoid spending altogether, but because they distinguish between debt that builds assets and debt that traps cash flow. Avoiding revolving credit and unnecessary financing quietly reclaims thousands in interest payments that can instead build their portfolio. Every avoidable liability increases their liquidity, magnifying the compounding effect already at work. Eventually, the mindset begins to shift. People aiming for real liquidity stops measuring success through possessions. They focus on flexibility, the ability to make choices without financial strain. Homes and cars matter less as a symbol of success and more as strategic decisions that either support or restrict freedom. Choosing a smaller home or simpler lifestyle stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like control. They measure wealth by how easily their assets can move, not how big those assets look on paper. That shift is what separates financial stress from financial stability. The difference isn't income, it's retention. The upper few percent of savers treat consistency as non-negotiable and freedom as the goal, not status. Each quiet decision, to automate, to invest early, to live beneath their means, builds towards control over time rather than constant consumption. If you're watching this, take a moment to think about where you are on that path. What habits could you automate today to move closer to genuine liquidity? Share your age and one financial goal below. Your answer might inspire someone just getting started. Because in the end, the odds can turn in your favor. With time, structure, and patience, liquidity becomes less about luck and more about design. And that understanding leads naturally to the deeper truth behind wealth itself. The part that's not about numbers, but about what those numbers actually let you do. Wealth at its core is about control, the ability to make choices without financial strain. $1 million net worth tied up in a house can look impressive, but it won't help you seize opportunities or handle emergencies. True financial strength comes from liquidity, cash, stocks, bonds, and retirement accounts that you can access when you need them. Focus on what you can actually use, not on numbers that look good on paper. Keep contributing consistently, especially when progress feels slow, and ask yourself one question. If your wealth isn't accessible tomorrow, how much of it truly belongs to you today?